I found them on a funeral world. Where else better to hide a band of fallen than amongst the dead, crouched between gravestones, mourning a legion lost? It's poetry, almost. Or melodrama. I approached them carefully, careful to show them that my blade was sheathed at my back, and careful to show them that I had not yet reached for it. They crouched around a fire, some ways off, a little leaning thing that spat more smoke than flame. They saw me. They had to have. But they hadn't moved. "Brothers," I call. I have found that you can glean a great deal about a legionnaire from how they respond to that word. If they reply with anger, with offense, then they are sane enough that brotherhood yet means something to them. If they laugh, if they make fun, then often they are too far gone. These three did not respond at all. They only turned to me, helmetless and scarred. "I am Knight Captain Malthael of the 1st Legion," I introduced myself, using a title that is 10 millennia out of date. "I have come from the lion's side to bring you home."
"Home is gone,"
comes the answer. Thick and sweet with corruption, formed around a tongue that I now can see is forked and barbed. "Enough remains," I answer. "Our legion remains, our father remains, and he calls his wayward sons home."
"The lion
The same one starts, standing.
had no forgiveness for his sons that were like us."
His cloak falls away to show me armor pitted and scarred by more than just battle. It is ceramite, but it is pustule. Antlers, horns, and barbs sprout from it as if it were a thorn bush. "Our father has changed," I promise. "He calls us home." Silence answers me from all three of them. "You will not come," I realize. The standing one shakes his head slowly, and my heart's hurt. It is not often I am reunited with brothers, true brothers from the Great Crusade, yet more and more often our meetings end like this. "Then, brothers," I reintroduce myself. "I am Malthael of the Deathwing, of the Dark Angels. I bring with me the will of our Father, and to those who would ignore it, I bring only death. Repent, ye fallen, for today you die." I kind of have a thing for black armored space marines. It started with this chaplain. I just started to really understand my painting style, and everything just kind of clicked with him. From there it was Death Company, Dreadnoughts, Knights, and eventually my Dark Angels, painted, of course, in their Heresy-era black armor. And that's where this video starts. Today I'm painting this Inner Circle companion, styled after the Deathwing companions of 30k, meaning that I've got to tackle both black and bone-colored armor. Even though I'll be painting a Dark Angel in this video, you can use this on whichever minis you want. It's the same technique that I use on my Chaplains, Death Company, and even Imperial Knights. If any of that sounds interesting to you, hang tight, we're about to get stuck in. My name's Colt, this is Gone Hollow Minis, and today we're tackling both black and bone armor in the Grimdark style. Black can be a pretty tricky color to paint. You constantly have to straddle the line between your shadows and your highlights while making sure the entire piece still reads as black. The main thing to understand is that your black model paint isn't actually black. Most often it's actually just a really, really dark blue. This is fine since to our eyes it usually looks black anyway, but if you don't believe me, check this out. I've primed this Space Marine pauldron with a black rattle can, then I hit it with a white spray from above. Now I'm going to apply a coat of Imperial Fist contrast paint. As I apply this over the black shadows, you'll see how the contrast paint takes a greenish hue. That's because, of course, most black pigments are actually just really dark blues. So why am I talking about this? We're painting black, not yellow. Well, understanding how our pigments work can actually really inform how we place our highlights and what colors we use to make those highlights. Take a look at any black object that's been left out in the sun for a while. Some things may just go gray, but others may turn a brown like this baseball cap or even into a dark purpley blue. And that's really the point here.
Not all black pigments would fade naturally into true grays. A lot of them turn blue or brown or even purple. And working some of those more interesting colors can really give our miniature a lot more contrast, a lot more depth, and a little bit more realism too. Now on that note, let's get into our paints. Like I said, there are a couple different ways you can go with this. If you want to do a more gray lean to your final project, here are some of the shades I would recommend. I, however, like to lean into the more blue spectrum. It can be hard to keep your highlights from overpowering your miniature while keeping your armor looking black, but I feel like it makes for a deeper feeling color in the end. Taking all this information to our model, we're going to start, as always, with a black base coat. Now, if you've seen any of my previous tutorials, you probably know that at this point I usually like to spend a little bit more time doing some value sketching on my miniatures. Usually I do this with a series of dry brushes from grays to white. However, since black can be such a strong, overpowering color, I think we're going to need something a little bit more aggressive this time. After my black base coat, I'm going to take a white rattle can and give my mini a quick zenithal. I did this just by holding my miniature at an angle and spraying in the direction that my light source would be coming from. After this, you can see that from above, the mini is almost purely white, while below, it's still black. This will just do a little bit of work to help keep our highlights visible, at least for our first few layers of paint. Okay, on to our actual colors here. We're going to start with a dark red. This is Vallejo Whole Red, darkened with just a tiny bit of black. We don't want this to be too bright, but keeping it noticeably red will make for some really nice oxidation effects on the edges and the recesses. Make sure to thin this down a bit, both so that we get even coverage and also so that we don't lose our zenithal on our first layer. Once we have that base color, we can move on to our layers. We're going to start with straight black paint. Using a sponge or an old beat up brush, we're going to apply black all over our armor panels. We want this to be textured and splotchy, leaving some of our red base coat in the recesses and on the edges of our armor panels. This will make it look like the paint has worn away here, to bare oxidized armor. Now, if you're here to paint Deathwing companions like I am, make sure to not go too heavy on the black armor parts. The lore of the Deathwing companions is that they turn their armor bone-colored wherever they've taken a wound in place of their charge. So pick out a few armor panels that you think would look good in bone, or that would fit your miniature story. For this guy here, I chose his helmet, his breastplate, and his tilt shield. Okay, with that aside, let's get back to our black recipe. Once we've gotten our first layer of black onto our miniature, everything from here is basically a highlight. The next layer is Vallejo German Gray. This is a nice dark bluish gray that will be a good step up from our black. This might come off as a little bit subtle, but trust me, when you're painting black, subtle isn't a bad thing. Just apply this within the areas that we just applied black to, making sure that there is still a red undercoat still visible on our edges and our recesses, and that there's still a layer of black between that and our German Gray. If you've seen any of my previous tutorials, you probably already understand the gist of how putting volumetric highlights on your miniature works in this style. But if you haven't seen that before, first off, welcome to the channel, and second off, don't worry too much, I promise it's not too hard. The goal of this painting style is to apply our textured highlights in a way that reflects how light would actually fall onto our miniature. We started this already by picking a light source in our zenithal step. We can take this another step further by starting to think of our Space Marine in terms of the shapes he's made of. Pauldrons are more or less spherical at the top. The shins and arms are cylinders, and the helmet usually is pretty much just another sphere. Understanding how to break these shapes up is really a key part of understanding this painting style. Just follow how each of those simple shapes would be highlighted. Apply each brighter layer in concentrically smaller areas, and you'll be good to go, I promise. Okay, these next layers are starting to get a little bit brighter, so make sure you're thinning your paints, and work out some of the excess onto the back of your thumb or a paper towel before taking it to your miniature. If you don't, you could take your mini straight out of black armor territory and directly into blue territory, and we don't want any surprise ultramarines. These next layers will really start to make our highlights and shadows pop. I'm going to mix a bit of Army Painter Night Sky into my Vallejo German Gray. Just a little bit, remember we're not going for blue here, but we do want just enough to make a notable shift from our previous layer. Now for our last layer. This is just straight Army Painter Night Sky. Applying this layer with a sponge or ratty brush would likely result in too much pigment being left behind. So instead I'm going to apply this using a fairly fine-tipped brush. This will give me a bit more control over where my highlights go. I'm going to apply those highlights with a series of scrapes, streaks, and stipples, giving me that last little bit of general texture while also adding some insinuations of extra scratches and battle damage. Now that's the base of our black armor done. And before we move on to the cleanup, I wanted to make one small point about this painting style. The reason I really like this style, and the reason why I think it's something that everyone should try, is because at any point in this process, so long as you're happy with how your miniature looks, you can go ahead and stop adding layers. The reason I consider this style of painting to be kind of speed painting is that you get to forgo the usual blends and highlights in favor of building up texture on your miniature. Sure, that means there are a lot more layers, but each of those layers is quick, easy, and pretty straightforward to apply. Now that said, I don't think this style is only good as a speed painting technique either. Instead, I like to think of it as a base. It gets the general tone, vibe, and atmosphere of my mini down early, while leaving me more time for the fun stuff. Things like weathering, the little personalization details, and little bits of freehand. That's the kind of stuff that I live for. That's why I enjoy painting. And giving myself more time for that is always a plus for me. But anyway, before we move on to refining our black armor, let's go ahead and tackle the bone. Bone colors can be a little tricky because actual bone has so many layers of age and weathering. Think of a bone or a skull that's been left in a mud puddle for too long. The top becomes a bright ivory color, fading to a series of tans and creams towards the bottom, to an almost ochre-y brown color, or maybe it hasn't seen the sun at all. Luckily, this painting style is really good at emulating just that type of wear and tear. From our red base color, we're going to start with Vallejo Chocolate Brown. Any medium brown here will work, but I like this shade for its warmth and saturation. Once that's on, we'll move up to a yellow ochre to start transitioning into lighter colors while keeping these first layers fairly warm. Next up is Vallejo Iraq Sand. Here we start shifting much more into more identifiably bone colors. Since this is a definite shift in tone, make sure to keep your paint thinned and don't load up your brush too much. Alright, last couple of layers here. Next up is Rakarth Flesh. We're using this to not only build up our highlight, but also to knock back a bit of the yellow warmth that some of our previous layers have had. We want that warmth in the recesses, but not so much in our highlights. Now one final layer here. We're going to be applying some brain matter beige with a finer brush, much like the final highlight on our black sections. This is a pretty pale white paint, so be careful with it. Just use it to apply some last grainy highlights and scratches before we finish up. Now you're probably noticing that using this technique on such a light color really illustrates how our layers work together. The buildup from reds to browns to creams adds a lot of visual depth to our armor panels, but it also really helps to tell our miniature's story. The distinct layers work to really show that this armor has seen the worst the galaxy has to offer. It's seen dirt, it's seen grime, and while it might be regularly maintained, sometimes the battle just takes priority. This Grimdark style shows that these Marines aren't fresh from the Fortress Monastery, and that a little bit of storytelling can do a lot of work to make your army feel more thematic, atmospheric, and characterful. But with our bone colors finished up, our armor is pretty much ready to go. Now just to spend a little bit more time on cleanup and a few last weathering steps. For the bone sections, I'm going to use some Army Painter Brigandine Brown. I'll thin this into a glaze and gently brush it towards the recesses and the bottoms of the armor. This is to add a bit more shading and, of course, another layer of grime. For the black armor, I'm trying something a little bit different. Here I'm using some Occultist Cloak Speed Paint. This is a nice bluish-black speed paint that's fairly transparent. I'm going to thin this down even more and apply this just to the shadows of my black armor, not the recesses, if that makes sense. This will make sure that the darkest parts of my armor stay dark, while the transparent blue hue of the speed paint helps to blend my shadows with the blue midtones and highlights. After that came the obligatory metallic edge highlights. I know that Space Marine armor is supposed to be a far future ceramic compound, but I think the metallic chipping on the edges does well to outline the shapes of my armor. Better than a drab gray or tan ceramic tone would, at least. After that, it was just a matter of putting the finishing touches on the rest of the miniature. Most of this was fairly straightforward, but I really liked how the red robes turned out. I've been experimenting with textured fabrics for a little bit now, and I think I'm starting to get the hang of it. If you'd like to hear my thoughts on this type of fabric texture, let me know in the comments and I'll add it to my Grimdark video backlog. But with my Space Marine done, I slapped him on a suitably swampy Grimdark base and was left with this. Black can be a tricky color, but it's also one that this style of painting is uniquely qualified to tackle. Applying the highlights volumetrically takes some of the guesswork out of the process, and the overall weathered vibe gives you a little bit more wiggle room with the colors of your highlights. I like my Marines worn, so I went fairly bright on the highlights here. If you'd prefer to keep yours darker, feel free to do so. Just keep in mind that you might lose out on a little bit of that contrast. I really enjoy using these techniques on black. Black armor weathers in a really interesting way, and this style emulates that pretty well, I think. I really hope that you give this technique a try on your Death Company, your Dark Angels, your Iron Hands, or really any other type of Space Marine. Even the traitorous ones, I guess. I'll try not to hold it against you. Thank you all so much for watching. Feel free to let me know what you thought of this recipe in the comment section below, and drop a like while you're down there. Subscribe if you want to keep in touch with all of my little plastic Space Marines, and until next time, be safe, be kind, and don't you dare go hollow.